So again, in order to simplify factorials, we have to figure out which one's bigger. And when there's numbers, it's pretty obvious which one's bigger. And 7 factorial means 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, all the way times down to 1. And 5 factorial, same thing, 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So what we can do is we can start expanding the bigger one, but once we get to 5, instead of writing 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, we can just stop there and say 5 factorial, because we notice that's also on the bottom. And then those would simplify, and you're left with just 7 times 6, which is 42. So for B, test your mental math skills, test your simplifying skills without a calculator. 10 factorial over 4 factorial, 6 factorial. Give you a head start. So I expanded the top one until I got to 6 factorial, because then I knew that would cancel out with that. I wrote 4 factorial. I wrote it down to 1. Do you see that you wouldn't need to write that last one if you didn't want to? Here, for simplifying, can you see that 4 times 2 is 8, so this will cancel with that. And then you're left with 10 times 9 times 7 divided by 3. And before we multiply the top all out, you might also notice that 9 divided by 3 can simplify to 3 over 1, which leaves us with just 10 times 3 times 7, or 210. 3 times 7 is 21, times 10, 210. And then sometimes we're going to have to factor factorials or simplify factorials where there's variables. And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky to figure out which one's bigger. Now in this one, I think it's quite obvious that n plus 2 is bigger than n. But you will have some later that will cause you to think. This is probably the trickiest one I can think of. Just because it has negatives, and because 3 is bigger than 2, you might be tempted to think that n minus 3 is bigger than n minus 2. I'm just saying you might be tempted to do that. So that's going to be the trickiest ones. But for this one, n plus 2 is definitely bigger. So we start expanding it. 1 less than n plus 2 is n plus 1. We keep going until we get to n. Then we write the factorial just with the n, because that's the same as what we did with our 7 factorial over 5 factorial. When 7 times 6, those ones don't have factorials, but when we got to 5, to show that we wanted to keep it going, we had the factorial. And this is all divided by n factorial. And since those are the same, we can simplify, and you're just left with n plus 2 times n plus 1. With the negatives like I have at the top. First of all, which one's bigger? The bottom one is bigger. n minus 2 is bigger than n minus 3. If you have trouble with that, put a number in for n, like 10. 10 minus 3 would be 7. 10 minus 2 would be 8. The bottom one is bigger. Now that I know the bottom one is bigger, I would keep the top the same, and I'd start expanding. What's 1 less than n minus 2? And this is where you're going to be tempted to write n minus 1, because 1 less than 2 is 1. But if it's n minus 2 and you subtract 1 from it, minus 2 subtract 1 will give you n minus 3. Can you see where you might make little mistakes? And then those are the same, and you'd simplify. Now what happens when you simplify and everything goes away on the top of a fraction? Just ignore it. So you're left with 1 over n minus 2.